My name is John. I'm with the Center for Ecumenical and Interreligious Engagement. And welcome to our first webinar. And with Reverend Dr. Stearman. And we have invited our advisory council member, Maruk Modakram, to introduce Reverend Dr. Stearman. So I will have her do so. Thank you. Please start.
Good day to you all. I welcome you all on behalf of the Seattle University Center for Ecumenical and Interreligious Engagement to our first webinar series. I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge that Seattle University and the Center are on the land of Duwamish and Coast Salish peoples. As a member of the Advisory Council at the Center, it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to our speaker today, Dr. Scott Stearman. Dr. Scott Stearman has served for 3 decades as a pastor in the Christian Baptist tradition. His experience includes congregations in Athens, Greece, and in Paris, France. Today, Dr. Stearman is a pastor in New York City, where he represents the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship and the Baptist World Alliance to the United Nations. He leads the NGO committees related to human rights and the freedom of religion and belief, and has been active in civil societies, advocacy at the high-level political forum around the UN's Agenda 2030. And sustainability development goals. Dr. Scott is on the board of the trustees at the Parliament of World Religions and serves as the board vice chair for the Parliament. Dr. Scott holds a PhD in philosophy from the University of Oklahoma, Master of Theology and Master of Divinity from the Princeton Theological Seminary and Southwestern Baptist, respectively. Reverend Dr. Scott, the floor is all yours. Welcome to Seattle University.
Thank you. I appreciate that lovely introduction and this opportunity very, very much. I'm grateful to you and to Dr. Trice for this opportunity just to speak to a few of you about work that I care passionately about, and a work that I actually believe can move the needle in a world that needs that needle moved so very, very much. Let me tell you what I'm going to tell you, and then I will tell you, and then I will tell you what I told you if we have time, and a good Aristotelian fashion. So what I want to do, just with the time that I have, is give you a very brief bio that tells my life story and how I got into this particular work that I'm doing and where that passion, I think, derived from. Secondarily, we'll show a little video. John is going to show a video that I think encapsulates the work at its best, or at least as it can be incarnated. Then the substance of what I want to say really revolves around, I want to call 3 case studies of the intersection of religion, ethnicity, and autocracy in its very worst forms. And so we'll talk about how these 3 atrocities in the world today are being met with advocates who are working in an interfaith space around the United Nations. And then we'll see what other things I can put into this time. And then at the close, of course, we're kind of opportunity for questions and some interaction. So again, thank you for being here. As was mentioned, I'm a Baptist, and that always causes a little bit of consternation among certain quarters in the world. As Maruk mentioned, I spent 8 years serving a church in Paris, France, English-speaking church in Paris. Many French would say to me, "Qu'est-ce que c'est un Baptiste?" What is a Baptist? It's maybe they were not nearly as numerous in France as they are like in Mississippi. And my answer was, well, Jimmy Carter and Martin Luther King Jr. were both Baptists. And that at least gave some sense of what at least Baptists can be, maybe at their best. There is in that tradition a strong adherence at its best to the Gospels, to the sense that we who follow Jesus actually ought to pay attention to what he says or said. And in my experience, I grew up in a rural setting in Oklahoma, a very conservative church, but it was a church that from which I learned a great deal and was encouraged and developed a great deal. I think it was church at its best. Certainly, in that setting, there were fundamental streams that I saw running by, but none of those were taken terribly seriously by the majority in that setting. I grew up and then went to a Baptist university where we read the real text. Where I learned Greek, where I encountered, of course, not just the biblical text, but the larger Western literature canon, which of course challenged this one Sunday school view of the world. And but also through that university, I was able to spend a summer in Xinjiang, China, which is the northwest corner of China, teaching English. Also through that experience, I was able to spend a summer just right out of university in Budapest, Hungary, Eastern Europe, teaching English. And so encountering the world at a relatively early age in a sort of globalized sense. And I learned through those encounters and through those real experiences, meeting, in fact, in Xinjiang, I was there in 1988, in a time when many people who lived in that capital city of Urumqi had never seen face-to-face a Western person, well, particularly a 6'3" skinny white boy. They thought I was quite an anomaly. But through all of these encounters and some fun, or mostly fun, some not, that dictum proved true for me, that the shortest route for self-knowledge runs around the world. The shortest route for self-knowledge runs around the world. And that's true for me. And through those experiences, I saw the world as a beautiful place and a wonderful place, and a place also that needs our compassion and compassionate action. So after years in Paris, my wife and I settled in St. Louis, and it is there, 12 years in St. Louis, that I really began to understand the importance of interfaith advocacy. There in St. Louis, Missouri, it was, of course, mostly around the issue of the extraordinary, stark racial division of that city and the institutional racism that continues to exist. When we landed in the city, we were told by a member of a church committee that we could not live in a particular neighborhood. That's probably a story for another day, but that gives you an idea. This neighborhood, this particular neighborhood we were forbidden from living in, not literally, but almost, was of course African-American. And it was that redlining thing. And then some of you, maybe all of you listening to this either now or later will know what Ferguson means. And we lived in St. Louis during that time. Prior to Ferguson, I experienced another shooting in a town closer to where we lived in St. Louis that spurred a sort of action on my part to gather with clergy of all sorts to begin to bring some racial healing in any way we could. And along with that, I learned in those years in St. Louis that you could gather interfaith clergy to do advocacy work around, for example, LGBTQ discrimination. And that particularly in the city council, folks would listen to you with ears maybe slightly different because they had their own grounding in faith or faith tradition. And they would hear the cry for compassion sometimes, not always, but sometimes from clergy with a little more attention. So fast forward to 2015, and there was an opportunity to come to New York to serve a congregation in Hell's Kitchen, and to help direct the advocacy work for the Baptist Global Body at the United Nations. And so I've been doing that work since 2015. And it has been quite a journey and something that I have been feel very blessed and fulfilled to do. Even if sometimes you feel like you've spent weeks, months doing very little of significance, very little movement of the needle, to use that metaphor. Okay, so what I would like to do is ask John to play a brief video, and this dates to March the 3rd of this year, and it's an event that I think encapsulates the height or the best maybe of what we can do as faith leaders across the interfaith, multi-faith spectrum when we come together around an important event in the world. We are responding to the global crisis of what's happening in Ukraine in the way that we know how to, which is to pray. And we've gathered multi-faith leaders from a variety of places. Most of them have some connection with the United Nations and the work that happens here around civil society. And so we have gathered in the chapel, Tillman Chapel of the Church Center for the United Nations. And it's across the street from the campus. It's been here for many years as a testament to the importance of faith and faith communities around what happens in that multilateral space of the United Nations. So we're here to pray, and we're also here to demand freedom for the Ukrainians and really for all humans.
It's important for faith leaders to gather whenever there is human suffering, whenever there are people who are being treated unjustly. It's important for those who say that they're led by faith to gather, not just to pray, but to pray and then to do something about what we're praying for, together. And being together was the best. That's the way that we move things, only together. Let us take a moment of silence for those who we have lost to senseless war.
Our religious traditions at their best stand at the foundation of human rights, even democracy, and that the onus is upon us to do everything we can to ensure that this ugly advance of autocracy is stopped.
We have several, as the Baptist World Alliance and BWA, we have several churches there on the ground. We have the All Ukrainian Union that coordinates those churches. They have over 2,000 churches that are working really hard to help those who have been displaced. And so this also lets them know directly how much the world is standing with them. We just thought it was even important to be here today at the United Nations. I think this is significant in itself.
Well, there are billions of people of faith all over the world. They make up the majority of our planet, and religious leaders and people of faith have to be the moral authority on matters, and it's very clear that what's happening in Ukraine is immoral. So it's important that we stand up and that we demand that moral action is taken, and that we pray for less violence and less hostilities in Ukraine today.
I read this morning's headline that there could be up to 1 million refugees right now. So one person really is fundamentally affecting lives in a devastating sense of 1 million. That just cannot stand. So we need to pray for some sense of recognition of what's happening in his own mind. And parallel to that, I think, is praying for the Russian people. There are a good number who are fighting the government's action. And then, of course, the vast majority is subject to the barrage of great misinformation and propaganda.
It's the #1 request we've received from Baptist leaders in Ukraine and across the region to pray for a cessation of war and the restoration of peace and communities that flourish together. It's been remarkable as we visited with leaders in Russia, Ukraine, and across the region that they are united in one spirit, pray for peace.
It is a powerful testament that we understand that religious diplomacy is important for all of us, for Baptists, for Christians, for Jewish, for Muslims, for Hindus, for everyone to stand together and prophetically prophetically pronounce that peace needs to happen.
Bishop Tutu says that, rest his soul, he said that our lives are inextricably bound. Humanity, because of humanity, we are bound together. So no matter where we are bound together. So even in wherever room you're in, whatever place you're in, pray. Pray that the hearts of faith leaders and leaders all over making decisions will change. And pray that those on the ground are protected and that there is a way of escape made now.
Let's also pray that the Lord will use this challenging moment to turn our spears into plows.
Don't give up. You are not alone. It may feel like you're dark. It's like things are too dark and you cannot see light. That's why we are praying for them. I would say to the Ukrainian people, keep holding on. And just the light of hope, it will not extinguish once you keep it alive. We are praying for you and sending the aid that is needed. Don't give up.
Thank you. Thank you, John, for playing that. So that's was a service that we were able to put together. Largely, I relied on a number of our trustees from the Parliament of the World's Religions, and of course, the relationships across other NGOs that are working, mostly FBS faith-based organizations that are working there in the UN space, seeking to advocate for various policies. And we were able to put together that service, which became very meaningful and which was attended by hundreds of people electronically, of course. And we were able in those early days, actually, very early days of the invasion, to be able to hear from Jewish and Baptist and other representatives in Ukraine. So it was a very moving time, and it's an example of something that I think can happen in this space as we work together as interfaith leaders. Now, that's if you'll excuse this term in this context, that's sort of a sexy thing. But a lot of what we do isn't nearly so flashy or interesting or moving. And I want to talk about, but it may be as important in the sense of actually changing aspects of what happens in the world. So I mentioned I want to talk about 3 case studies of this intersection of religion, ethnicity, and an autocracy, or even in one case genocide, for sure, and actually probably 2 cases, and in fact possibly 3. But then we get into definitions. But first, I wish we could be in a room together physically, and I could see your faces, and I would ask you if you have actually how much you know about, how much you've heard about the Uyghurs of Xinjiang. I expect in this environment, most of you are aware that the Uyghurs are a Turkish minority that lived in this region of Northwest China, Xinjiang, for centuries. And when I was there in 1988, this was a different China even than today. And I was at Xinjiang University, and there was this conversation. We actually met with the presidents of the university. There was a Uyghur president, and there was a Han Chinese president. And government officials lectured us on how we had 2 traditions and 2 ethnicities, but they were in harmony, and they would work together, and they were, well, they painted a picture, a very rosy picture of ethnic and religious harmony. But of course, that was pre-9/11, and that was before some extremist events that happened, not many, but a few in that region. And suddenly, or over some time, the entire tenure and sense of any kind of cohabitation has disappeared. And what has happened is a complete subjugation of an entire ethnic group. And the estimates vary, and many of you know that the High Commissioner is making a visit, in fact, and is there after a long time. But there has multiple reports of encampments, concentration camps, and in fact, forced labor multiple accounts of just disappearances, multiple accounts, of course, of people just being told that they can no longer practice a religion in any way that is authentic to them. And so it's very, very disconcerting. It has been to anybody paying attention for quite some time. So what has come out of this most recently, as of last year, though, on a positive light, is that there was a good deal of advocacy on the U.S. side to pass a law called the Forced Labor Prevention Act. And this is something that forces companies, multinational, but anybody doing business in the United States, it would force them to trace any of the raw materials that they're getting from that part of China to ensure that it isn't being produced in any way that crosses standards of traditional human rights. And so that it took, of course, a good deal of effort to get that across and get that passed. And it's interesting to note, I think, for me, that in fact, US companies, US-based companies, that many of us think of as good actors, for example, Apple, lobbied against this legislation. And that's an example of what I think we as interfaith and compassionate, concerned advocates on the international domain, what we face. We face, of course, the big green monster of greed that would subjugate all human rights to good business. And even a company like Apple not willing to sacrifice profits for what many of us would be considered just basic human decency. So the Uyghur situation is something that we must continue to pay attention to. It continues to be quite egregious. China has been quite aggressive about sanctioning members of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. Most of the commissioners who have said anything about the Uyghur situation have been sanctioned. Researchers in Germany, one of the best researchers on this, has been completely sanctioned. So all that aggressiveness makes one think that they know that we know what is going on, and they don't like us knowing, and don't like us talking about it. The second situation is something I expect many of you are aware of, and that is what's happened in Burma. February the 1st, last year, not this year, but last year, February the 1st, 2nd, the military of that country that basically has had ruling power for decades, but has seceded that in what looked to be like a growth, a trajectory of democracy, I think decided they didn't really like democracy. And so there was the coup that took place on February the 1st in 21. And ever since then, the country has been in a kind of a massive, ugly civil war. Prior to that, many of you know that the Rohingya people, which is an ethnic tribe in Burma, had experienced what we now know is clearly genocide. Burma is a Buddhist country, but majority Buddhist. One ethnic group, as I mentioned, the Rohingya, are largely Muslim. There are a couple of tribal groups or ethnicities that are largely Baptist, and this is something that many don't know, but there are almost 2 million Baptists in Burma. And so there is, well, kind of in the United States, both a large group of the Burmese diaspora, as we call them, Burmese who have immigrated to the United States, who are Baptist, both Shin minority and there's a Kachin minority that are largely Baptist. And then, of course, many American Baptists have a long 200-year history of a connection to the people of Burma. And so these folks have come together to advocate, quite forcefully advocate for a strong response, both at the UN level as well as at the US level, to what's happened in Burma. right now, a major bill has passed the U.S. Congress called the Burma Bill of 2021, which would sanction some of the military leaders. It would sanction also the oil industry, and it would provide a great deal of humanitarian aid, and it would call for some recognition of what's called the National Unity Government, which is a combined effort of different ethnic groups all over the country to form a government that would be in opposition to the military leaders. What makes this particularly religious interesting is that, of course, it is a Buddhist majority that is in control, and that both the ethnic tribal groups who typically identify as a particular religion or faith tradition are subjugated in a way that was counter to any teachings that anyone would ever encounter in Buddhism. Well, the third thing that I want to talk about, of course, and we can have some interaction about, of course, is Ukraine. And what's happened in Ukraine is, for all of us, heart-wrenching, disturbing beyond measure. It seems in some ways particularly egregious because of just the decision of fundamentally one person, obviously backed up by other leaders in the country. But it seems as if this decision to invade and to bring about the destruction of a great deal of infrastructure and what looks like more than just accidental collateral damage on human beings, and the bombing of hospitals and where children clearly are present, et cetera, et cetera. So those images that we have a hard time getting out of our mind. And to cause, I mentioned the video on what is March 3rd, the number 1 million refugees seem extraordinary. Well, we know, of course, the number is great deal more than that. So all that to say, I think our response as a country and as people in the West in general has been appropriate, in the sense that we have thrown almost everything we can, besides sending our own military into the situation. It seems to me we've done almost everything we can to counter this atrocity. But an interesting thing, of course, it has happened is that as I have engaged in State Department around the Burma Bill, as I've worked with other folks in the United Nations at various places to talk about what's happening in China, it's as if the Ukraine has kind of taken all the oxygen out of the room. I have friends who work on the border, southern border of the United States, in both advocacy as well as compassion action to the immigrants. And, they describe, of course, how odd it is that we have thrown our arms, as we should, open to people coming from the Ukraine, all of whom have white skin. And when other humans are coming from places that are not a whole lot better, but have darker skin, it seems as if there's a double standard. And so another place where this intersection of ethnicity and religion and our compassion response gets all muddled, to use the word, the best word I know. And what this says to me is, it says that there is a call for yet another need for people who are willing to come together across all religious divides and divisions, across all races, to say that we have got to do better as a human race, recognizing the immense and inherent dignity of every human person, no matter where they come from, no matter who or what they worship, or if they don't worship at all, no matter what language, and no matter what gender or sexual orientation. And that we've got a lot of work to do, before we can, I think, really fully embrace that, it seems to me. So I think what I do want to prompt you just to be thinking about relevant questions or comments you might have, maybe even advice you'd have for those of us seeking to work in this world. And hopefully we can have some semblance of a conversation around this question of how we bring compassionate advocacy to a world that is so filled with actors that seem bent on control and seem to not appreciate in any sense the need for individual humans to live in freedom and to worship in freedom. And I think what I want to do, and I have just a few minutes before we want to pause for those questions. So I think what I'd like to do is just close with a little bit of the grounding of my own faith and my own faith tradition, and what the foundation upon which I stand as a Christian, and how I think that propels me to cross boundaries. So just a quick story about Jesus that the Gospel of Luke tells, that Jesus, as he began his ministry, walked into his home synagogue. He called for the opening of the scroll, and he reads out of Isaiah 61. And this is the outset of his ministry. And he says, I have the Lord's anointing, and my call is to preach good news to the poor, to lift up the downtrodden, to help the blind see, to help the captives go free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, or the year of the Jubilee, which was basically a year of economic reprieve. So that's at the very outset of Jesus's ministry. And then from that, he immediately goes into a talk about how, in fact, God was at work across ethnic divisions in their own tradition. And he mentioned several stories where God in the Hebrew scriptures healed people who were not Orthodox or ethnic Jews. Simon the leper is so he mentions these stories, and he gets in so much trouble, and there's so much disgust at what he says that some people from his hometown try to throw him off the cliff. Now, this to me gets to the very heart of both the call of faith, which is to live out lives of compassion, which is centered on meeting human needs, lifting up those who are down, and releasing those who are captive, and helping people recover, economically speaking. And this deep-seated, disgusting, vile tribalism that not one of us are completely immune to, but yet all of us called to live beyond. And the reason I have remained a Christian is because at the heart of it for me is Jesus' teachings of the ever, ever, ever expanding circle of human empathy, and that to grow spiritually means to grow in our empathetical circle. And it is to recognize indeed that every human is worthy of our love and respect. So I think with that, I'm going to pause and see what insights you have to bring and what questions you might have of specificity. There may be some questions about exactly how this works.
Terrific. Dr. Stearman, can you hear me okay?
Yes, just fine.
Yeah, just thank you very much for opening the conversation, and to Maruk Motorfram, who's introduced you, and for bringing these topics in front of us. John's asked me to provide a couple of questions. As we know, other questions will be coming into the chat feature, and we encourage people then, of course, to write your questions directly into the chat feature. I'll begin by just asking a couple of questions of you as we're thinking through some of these main themes in particular. You know, one of the challenges that we've spoken about in terms of food security now in the world with regard to the challenges that we're seeing, Ukraine, for instance, is that it's created more complications than less in terms of food stores or what's available for communities and what we're anticipating in terms of the challenges that we see related to hunger or increasing hunger in the world. Could you speak also a little bit about that as we're waiting for questions? You know, what do you see as a couple of the kind of core challenges, and how are religions poised to also provide a semblance of moral voice to that as well?
I was having lunch yesterday with a congregant who actually is a large business in the fertilizer industry, oddly enough, but and he's quite concerned about the food chain, just given given the amount of grain that comes to Ukraine, and given the amount of fertilizer that comes out of Russia, and a lot of the raw material that is used. And so it's both a question of grain shipment as well as a question of yield. And will there be will we have crops wherever they're grown that have the yield needed to feed hungry mouths? So yeah, I think this is a real concern. And I'm not sure that, well, at least what I'm reading is that people, you know, in the United States are likely going to be fine. Our pocketbooks will be cramped, but we're going to be okay. But there will be places where this really impacts people's, people will be living in malnutrition and possible starvation. So I think one answer to that is part of we have got to continue to call for some sense of equity and recognition that we have to step up in these situations as the United States. And, if the vaccine distribution is any indication, we're likely not going to do it very well, but at least we can bring a voice to the need. Yeah. Scream a lot, try to encourage it. And there are great Bread for the World. There are some great large not-for-profits that are doing good work and that do direct advocacy on that very question.
Mm-hmm. Is there, in terms of I just want to remind others, as you have questions, please drop them directly into the chat. Anything you've heard that Dr. Stearman said or a question you have related to his work, as he is working in the area with a number of other interreligious colleagues, religiously based colleagues through the United Nations. They're working collaboratively on many of these same issues. One of the points that you made as well in terms of integrity, the need to come together irrespective of race or gender or any of the issues that plague society so well, but in a time where we also see both nationally in the United States and internationally the rise of hate groups, the rise of kind of animosity-based groups. You can see that from the US to Brazil to the UK. It's challenging, isn't it, in terms of how religions are meant to respond to this, because it's not new information. It just feels like it's become more exacerbated. What's your sense of, is that an accurate depiction? What else would you add to that? And what's your sense or gut sense of where we need to be in terms of our response to this as well?
It's like somebody has cooked up a really ugly recipe, right? Or some witch's brew, because to put in, a really, I think, an unfortunate, whatever you thought of the last administration, just the rhetoric of the last administration was very unfortunate. Mm-hmm. And then you throw social isolation because of the pandemic into this ugly brew. And then a society in which we pass out guns like candy And so it just seems, and we have these incidents, whether Buffalo or in Texas, again and again and again. And it just seems as if we are, mixing up something quite dangerous. And you would like to think faith communities would be a part of the answer. And I'm convinced interfaith communities are. But of course, I could, in the Christian tradition, particularly in the South, but not just, but in the evangelical to Protestant traditions, you've just got churches that are battling themselves, interior battles over some of these same issues, right?
Right.
And rights, or obviously white supremacy is, I know of just recently, this is a respected accountant who in all ways seems like a compassionate person, but he's not sure that institutional racism is a thing. No. And I don't know what to do with that after in the world we live. But well, I do know what to do with it. It just requires a little bit of work.
Well, let me. There's one question from Kathy Sharp. Kathy notes. I'll just read it aloud so you have it, Dr. Stearman, and then you can kind of respond as I'm thinking of the question, or as I'm addressing the question. I also come. She notes from a Christian tradition, one that was born in the notion of being God's chosen people, and now completely rejects and critiques that notion, as well as the deeply held notion within Americans that the U.S. is God's favorite, American exceptionalism. How can interfaith leaders make an impact on this deeply loved, ingrained belief that America is better, more loved, more perfect, more sacred than any other nation, ethnicity, or religion, also preferencing Christians and whites over others? Look at that.
Yeah, boy, that's putting a finger on it right there. I also grew up with this chosen people, and of course it's all over both. It's part of the Hebrew tradition too, God's chosen people, obviously. And the Christians inherited this and adopted, embraced it. And, I've come to terms personally with the idea of being one of God's chosen people to be a servant and to the many, as is everyone else actually chosen to do the same thing as it comes down to it. But, and so I think it's a different thing when you say, well, I have been called, chosen to be a servant, which I think might actually be the original view of at least some of the prophets. Mm-hmm. And I guess in the same sort of vein, I would say that's where it would be nice to think the United States would adopt this kind of vision of itself as a very privileged people who is going to use its privilege to bring compassionate help to the world. But I think that's very different than America as being the first and having the right answer. And but I do agree with those people who say, given what's happened in the United States, January 6th, for example, that's very humbling for us. Yeah. And given what's happened on the streets and around, institutional racism, I think we've had to recognize that we don't have a lot to really preach at people about. So I think there is a little bit of humility that at least thoughtful people find naturally easy to embrace as Americans, whereas maybe a couple of decades ago, we really thought we were that city on the hill with the shining light that everybody should emulate us. So maybe that's a slight silver lining in the darkness.
There's another question that came through here in the chat, the culture of violence in America and beyond. This person would like you to comment on that, what you're learning about creating a more life-giving culture. I think this is aligned to some of the points you just made, more life-giving culture that allows us to really address some of the things you're talking about. What would be in that kind of culture of violence? I think even the kind of signs of hope for a life-giving culture. What do you see? What are the steps? What's the role of religion plays? And maybe I think I also hear you in that. What's the role of an active citizenry playing in that? Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I'm troubled by this. I think we have such a culture of fear in some places, so much so that people think the ban of an assault weapon would be transgressing their God-given rights. It's hard for me to get my mind around it. And yet it's a reality that we must struggle to try to understand. And it seems to me that churches ought to be a place where we are bringing a vision of every human having dignity and worth, and every human being somebody that we want to embrace and hear from and learn from and appreciate. And I know that happens in religious communities. I think when people are living in compassionate relationships, I think it's much harder to ignore the needs that are so evident of people who are suffering. But I don't know. I don't think I have any easier trite or trite answers that sound anything but trite around this almost a national crisis, I think. And if someone does, I'd love to hear.
Yeah,
I would love to hear.
Yeah, maybe others, if you don't just have a question but have a comment in particular on this point, we're welcome to hear that as well. I want to call on John to see if you have another question there that I may not be able to see yet.
Yes, we do have a question from Maurice Blom.
Great, go right ahead.
Okay. COVID, the war in Ukraine, rising numbers of displaced people, climate change should all make us realize that we are interconnected and that we can only solve these issues together as a world. However, it seems that after an initial empathy period, the world goes tribal. What role can the church and/or people of faith play to really address this, except for prayer? And looking at social media, especially the young people in this world who are tired of thoughts and prayers and want to see action. And Coach Steve Kerr from Warriors is right there with them. And should the church not solve its own issues, splitting up, not speaking out enough about rights of all God's people, etc.?
Yeah, great comment and question. Absolutely. Yeah, as I mentioned, for me, the heart of Jesus's teachings is that he is constantly teaching us to get beyond these ethnic and tribal distinctions, right? And he both teaches that and models it. And we see that. And so that for me is elemental. So one would hope that could become really a part of the message that, and this, of course, we find this in our religious tradition. So I think the point of, bouncing back to tribalism after immediate empathy is exactly what does happen. So we've got to find some ways to move beyond that impulse. I don't know if this is going to be meaningful or not, but so after the Texas event, where those children and seeing and just thinking about that yet again, my own emotional response was to not engage and really almost to turn off social media, because I feel like I'm having a little PSCD in that I'm just seeing these same messages and the same trite things said on both sides, and it's not getting us anywhere, which is to this comment that's made. It's like we have this empathy, and then we go back to our battle cries. What was one the greatest one? Well, Cain killed Abel with a rock, but God didn't ban rocks. This kind of just stuff that I just can't take it anymore. And so I'm sorry that I don't have much of an answer besides clearly we need to take this, the we being people of faith across all faiths, need to take this moment very seriously. And we need to find places and ways to get together to strategize. How do we, with some sense of coming out of who we are, but also some vision and strategy, how do we meet the needs of the moment?
Mm-hmm. In terms of the needs of the moment, if we have another, say, 10 minutes of conversation, I wonder if you and others have also reflected on, Dr. Stearman, the fact that we're still in this pandemic, but perhaps the optimist in me would think that it would have taught us some things about how we want to conduct ourselves in the world. And then, of course, we have an invasion in Ukraine as one of the 3 examples that you've identified, among others. What is your sense, or maybe we could share that as well, your sense of how that, what your expectations or hopes are, what you're hearing in conversation about what we're learning from this pandemic or can learn, or how that might inform our actions going forward? And do you see signs of hope in that work, or do you also see, as others, with this invasion, signs of real moral challenge? What do you?
I think the sign of hope, one sign of hope, is that there's been a real wake-up call, I think, in Europe, maybe, as well as here, that autocracy is really on the ascendancy. It's on the rise, and I think this action of Putin has waked some people up that really thought, okay, China's bad, but we can kind of ignore it. And people were, and maybe it's because of white supremacy is clearly in the mix. Burma is, they're still finding their way, but the threat to this independent nation that now no more than a threat, the invasion, I think it has caused a kind of reaction, a kind of unity in our own government as well as in Europe. I mean, that's good, I think. I think we need to recognize this as a serious moment, that people who believe in fundamental human rights and values and the freedom of people to worship as they choose, we've got to come together, and otherwise, we fear losing it. And, behind that, of course, is this sense that we as the United States don't completely have our act together there. And January 6th has been, and all that's around that is a real threat to our own democracy, et cetera. But oddly enough, I mean, maybe this will crystallize our thinking, and when we see how dangerous the world really is.
Mm-hmm. There's an additional question that I think just came up. John, could you read that question?
Yes, this question is from Kusumita Peterson. My question or comment is similar. How can we most effectively and powerfully hold up and promote widely the values of universality, of human dignity, that every human being is worthy of respect? We, meaning people of all faiths and goodwill.
Yeah, I know Kusumita, so I know one answer she would want me here to would want me to say is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights would be a great way to go about that. And someone who I appreciate the document and all that went into it, and all that it stands for and all that it means in that moment. But of course, I don't know how good a job we do actually teaching that in schools. But I think, both that is both a serious and important moment in human history. I learned this in my very conservative Baptist church in rural Oklahoma, and this is not a very politically correct song, but I grew up singing it, red and yellow, black and white, they're all precious in his sight. Now that's a song that again has all kinds of problems in it, but the underlying message that no matter your skin color, your ethnicity, your background, you're all the same in God's sight was just part of my, it was steeped in the tea. So now I saw a lot of transgressing of that in a lot of ways, but yet at the same time, I always knew that principle was there. So, hopefully this happens in religious teachings of all faiths, right? And I know it does in the best of all our traditions. But of course, it also, I think, is a fundamental aspect of democracy when it's lived into. But I mean, I think, again, that is the heart of the question. Mm-hmm. How do we both teach it, live into it, enable people to see the value of it?
Well, you pause for maybe one more question, but as you're thinking of this, the economic sanctions in response to the war in Ukraine or the invasion of Ukraine is one way in which it seems like the West, at least initially, lived into that as a moral response.
That's right.
Integrated moral response.
Yeah.
Maybe that gives some hope to how we might respond to the earlier suggestion and question on a changing climate, like what are the universal, what are the responses that we might have to those universal claims that we know should guide our everyday life.
Yeah.
I think we may be, I'm just looking to see, there's another question. John, do you have anything there in the list?
I do not see another question at this time.
Well, that's fine. I want to give Dr. Stearman, you an opportunity if you'd like to say anything to close out our time, and then I'm just going to thank you and thank everyone for joining us. Why don't we begin? Again, Dr. Stearman, is there anything that you'd like to say that you haven't kind of framed or would like to take a moment with? We want to give that time to you as well in the couple minutes to remaining.
Yeah, no, I just want to say a word of thank you for this opportunity. And I think clearly from the questions and from anybody who would take time in the afternoon to be a part of something like this, everyone listening is a person who desires for the world to be a better place. And I will leave with a quote from Mandela that I encountered a few years ago that helped me recognize this struggle for what it is. He says, in the climb up the hill for social justice, when one reaches the top, one finds yet more hills. And I think that that's just the way that it goes. We climb, we make progress, we may reach a mountaintop, we may have a great vista of some success, but we find yet more mountains to climb.
Well, on behalf of the Center for Ecumenical and Interreligious Engagement at Seattle University, a thank you to you, Dr. Stearman. Thank you as well, Maruk Motaphram, for your introduction, and to John Malcolmson for your program coordination. Dr. Stearman reminded us in terms of encountering the world from China to Hungary. He mentioned his experience in St. Louis and the Congregation Hell's Kitchen, and at the UN, working in collaboration for the Baptists. And the quote from Bishop Tutu, our lives are inextricably bound up together. But what I'll take away as well is your sense of how we engage the world, which is to say the shortest route for self-knowledge runs around the world. A beautiful place, but also a place that requires compassionate action. We'll continue to do that. This is the first of our webinars series. Our next one begins on February 22nd in the academic year coming. Thank you again, Dr. Stearman, for your time. I wish all of you a great afternoon.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.